The moment I saw him walk through my villa gate without hesitation, I knew something didn't add up. My name is Ethan Carter, and I've learned that the quietest moments in life are usually the ones that change everything. My wife Olivia and I had built what most people would call a comfortable life. A modern villa just outside Austin, Texas, about 3,200 square feet of glass, stone, and silence that usually felt like peace. That evening, the air was warm, the kind of Texas night where the sky holds on to the last bit of orange light long after sunset. Olivia told me she was inviting someone from her college years, a friend she hadn't seen in a long time. She said it casually, like it didn't matter, like the past was just something you open a door to and then close again. I didn't object. I didn't question it. That's how things had been between us lately, polite, measured, careful. But something in her tone stayed with me longer than it should have. When Jason Miller arrived, I noticed how easily he moved through the entrance, how the gate didn't hesitate for him. There was no call, no confirmation, no pause. Just access. Olivia greeted him with a smile that looked practiced, familiar in a way I couldn't place. Jason acted like he had been here before, like the space already remembered him. I told myself it was nothing. People reconnect. Old friends catch up. That's normal. But normal doesn't usually come with missing explanations. As we sat down for dinner, I watched them more than I participated. Olivia laughed at things that didn't seem particularly funny. Jason spoke about memories I wasn't part of. And I sat there, listening, observing, noticing the small gaps between what was said and what was real. I asked one simple question, mostly to myself at first. If he was just a guest, why did he know how to get in without asking? Olivia brushed it off, saying it was just old convenience, something from the past that never got updated. Jason smiled, but didn't correct her. And that silence said more than either of them realized. I looked around the villa, the place I thought I knew completely, and for the first time, it felt like I was seeing it through someone else's memory. Something about the structure of that night felt carefully arranged, like every detail had been placed slightly out of alignment on purpose. I didn't accuse anyone. I didn't raise my voice. I simply watched, because sometimes the truth doesn't announce itself. It waits for you to notice it first. I didn't know what I was looking at yet, but I knew I had stopped feeling certain about anything in that house. The villa didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like a place I was slowly learning for the second time. And I wasn't sure I liked what I was starting to see. The rest of the evening never returned to feeling normal after that question lingered in the air. I stayed quiet, not because I had nothing to say, but because I wanted to understand what I was actually looking at before I reacted to it. Olivia continued talking as if everything was smooth, asking Jason about his flight, his work, his life in a way that felt overly comfortable for two people who had not seen each other in years. Jason answered easily, almost too easily, like he had rehearsed none of it but remembered all of it at the same time. I noticed how he kept glancing around the villa, not like a guest admiring a home, but like someone confirming details he already knew. The dining room lights reflected off the glass walls, and for the first time I started paying attention to the structure of the house itself instead of the conversation. Every access point, every hallway, every entry line suddenly felt like something I had taken for granted. At one point, I stood to get more water, and that is when I saw it again, Jason moving toward the side corridor without hesitation, as if instinctively knowing where it led. I stopped just long enough to observe him pause at a door before Olivia called his name, redirecting him back to the table with a soft laugh that felt slightly forced. I told myself there might be reasonable explanations, but the list of those explanations was shrinking. Later, when Olivia stepped away to take a phone call, I remained seated with Jason, letting silence settle between us for the first time. He tried to make casual conversation, asking how long we had lived in the villa, but the way he asked felt unnecessary, like he already knew the answer. I gave him a simple response, nothing more, watching his reaction carefully. He nodded like he was confirming something rather than learning it. When Olivia returned, she immediately filled the space with energy again, but I could feel the difference in the atmosphere now, like a subtle pressure had built under the surface of everything we were saying. After dinner ended, Jason mentioned stepping outside for air and moved toward the back terrace without asking for directions. That was the second time I noticed it. He did not hesitate at doors or corridors, and that detail stayed with me longer than anything else he said that night. Olivia joined him briefly, leaving me alone in the kitchen where the quiet suddenly felt heavier than before. I walked slowly through the villa afterward, not searching for anything specific, just observing how familiar everything should have felt yet no longer did. Then I checked the security panel near the entryway, something I rarely ever touched. That is when I saw it, a guest access log that had entries I did not recognize, including one dated 2 weeks earlier, tied to a temporary access update. My name was still listed as owner, but there was another entry above it that made no sense at first glance. Jason Miller, authorized access. I stood there longer than I intended, staring at the screen while the rest of the house remained quiet behind me. Nothing about it was loud or dramatic, but something fundamental had shifted in the way I understood the space I lived in. And for the first time that night, I realized the question was no longer just how he knew the gate code, but who had given him permission to know it in the first place. Standing in front of the security panel, I felt a strange calm settle over me, the kind that does not come from answers but from the moment right before you realize how many questions you have been avoiding. The screen still showed the access log, clean and precise, with timestamps that did not match anything I remembered authorizing. Jason Miller's name remained there, as if it had always belonged. I traced the entries again, noticing one detail I had missed at first. The update request had been approved remotely, not from inside the villa but through an external administrative channel tied to Olivia's account. That realization did not arrive with shock, it arrived with weight, slow and undeniable. I stepped away from the panel and looked down the hallway where the evening had unfolded just minutes earlier. Voices still echoed faintly in my memory, but now they felt disconnected from the structure of the house itself, like they belonged to a different version of the night. I walked back toward the kitchen, not because I expected anything different there, but because I needed to see Olivia again with this new information sitting quietly in my mind. She was still on the terrace with Jason, speaking softly, their silhouettes framed by the glass doors and the dim outdoor lights. There was nothing overt in their interaction, no dramatic gesture, nothing I could point to as proof of anything specific, and yet the ease between them now carried a different meaning. I did not interrupt them. Instead, I observed the distance between where they stood and where I stood, and it felt larger than the physical space. When Olivia finally returned inside alone, she seemed relaxed, almost relieved, as if the evening had gone exactly as she expected. I asked her a simple question, keeping my tone steady, asking if she had updated any of the villa's access permissions recently. She paused for just a fraction of a second before answering, saying it was probably a system update, or something handled by property management. Her response was smooth, but it arrived slightly too quickly, like it had been prepared in advance. I nodded as if accepting it, but internally I marked the inconsistency. Jason returned shortly after, and I noticed again how naturally he moved through the space, never hesitating at transitions between rooms, as if he had memorized the layout over time rather than experienced it once. When he eventually said he should leave for the night, Olivia insisted on walking him out personally, leaving me alone once more in the living room. I sat there longer than necessary, listening to the quiet settle back into the villa, and I began replaying every moment from the time he arrived. Nothing was loud enough to be called evidence, but everything together formed a pattern that refused to stay random. Later, when Olivia came back inside, she asked if I was tired, her voice gentle, almost careful. I said I was fine, but I could feel the distance growing in ways that had nothing to do with physical space. That night, after she went upstairs, I returned to the security panel one more time and exported the full access history to my personal device. As the file transferred, I realized I was no longer looking for confirmation of something I suspected. I was trying to understand how long I had been standing inside a situation I had not fully seen. And for the first time, I understood that the real question was not about Jason's presence in my home, but about how many decisions had already been made without me noticing. The silence of the villa after midnight felt different once I knew there were layers to it I had not been aware of. I stayed in the living room with my laptop open, the exported access files still loading line by line as if it was revealing a version of my own home I had never been shown before. Each entry was precise, timestamps aligned with moments I had not questioned at the time, and yet now they stood out like markers on a map I had walked without paying attention to direction. I scrolled slowly, noticing that Jason Miller's access was not a single event but a pattern spread across several dates, each one brief, each one carefully timed during hours when I was not home. That detail alone shifted the weight of everything I thought I understood. I opened the system settings for the Villa security interface and checked the administrative history, something I had never had reason to inspect before. There I found a record of permission adjustments tied to Olivia Carter's account, including an authorization change that allowed temporary guest access codes to be generated remotely. The entries were not hidden, but they were also not obvious, sitting quietly in a log that most people would never think to open. I leaned back in my chair, not reacting outwardly, but letting the information settle into place. Olivia had mentioned property management earlier, but the system showed no third-party involvement in those changes. Everything traced back to internal approval. I closed the laptop for a moment and looked around the room, noticing how familiar everything still appeared while simultaneously feeling less certain about what it represented. The furniture, the lighting, even the quiet hum of the house systems now felt like part of a structure that had been adjusted without my full awareness. I walked to the kitchen and poured a glass of water, more out of habit than need, and tried to reconstruct the timeline of events in my mind. Jason's arrival, his familiarity with the villa, Olivia's calm explanations, each moment now appeared connected in a way I had not initially recognized. It was not a single action that stood out but the accumulation of small permissions, each one harmless on its own but significant when viewed together. I returned to the laptop and cross-checked the network logs, noticing a brief external login to the system 2 weeks earlier, originating from Olivia's registered device while she was supposed to be on a weekend trip to San Diego. The login duration was short, only long enough to modify access settings before disconnecting. I did not jump to conclusions, but I also did not ignore what the data was showing. I saved every file locally, creating a separate backup folder labeled only with the date, then shut the system down. As I sat there in the dim light of the villa, I realized the situation was no longer about one question or one moment of uncertainty. It had become a sequence of decisions made around me rather than with me, each one subtle enough to be dismissed in isolation but impossible to ignore when connected. I did not confront anything that night, and I did not speak to Olivia when she briefly came downstairs for water, because I understood that whatever was happening was not yet complete, and incomplete truths were often the most revealing when given time to surface. By the time morning light reached the edges of the villa, I had already stopped thinking in terms of coincidence. I was thinking in terms of structure, timing, and intent. I had not slept, not because I was anxious in the usual sense, but because my mind had settled into a state of continuous observation, replaying every detail from the past several days with new clarity. Olivia moved through the kitchen as she normally did, preparing coffee, asking simple questions about my night, her tone steady and unchanged. Watching her now, I noticed how controlled everything felt, as if even the smallest gestures were part of a routine designed to maintain normality. I responded without revealing anything I had discovered, matching her tone, keeping everything balanced on the surface while noting every inconsistency underneath it. Jason Miller was not mentioned. Not by her, not by me. But his presence was no longer limited to memory. It had become embedded in data, in system logs, in permissions that did not exist the week before. After she left for what she said was a meeting in downtown Austin, I returned to the security console again, this time reviewing network access patterns in detail. I isolated the exact timestamps tied to the modifications and cross-referenced them with Olivia's device activity history. The overlap was precise. The system showed an administrative login from her device at 10:14 a.m. On a Saturday 2 weeks earlier, a time when she had told me she was visiting her sister in Houston. The modification lasted less than 4 minutes, but within that window, guest access permissions were updated, including a temporary override that allowed pre-approved entry without real-time verification. I stared at the screen longer than necessary, not because I did not understand it, but because I was trying to understand the reason behind it. I exported the full network report and stored it in a separate encrypted folder, then began reviewing external device connections. That is when I noticed a secondary pattern, a brief connection handshake between the Villa system and an unknown device identifier that repeated only twice, both times aligning with Jason Miller's visits. The identifier was not registered in the household inventory, but it had been recognized by the system as previously authenticated. That detail changed the direction of my thinking entirely. It was no longer about access alone, but about recognition, about prior authorization that had not been explained. I stepped outside onto the terrace, letting the morning air settle around me while I tried to separate what I knew from what I still did not. The villa looked the same as it always had, but my perception of it had shifted in ways that could not be reversed. Every door, every entry point, every quiet corner now carried the possibility of having been part of something I was not included in. When Olivia called later that afternoon to ask if I wanted dinner reservations for the weekend, I told her I would think about it, keeping my voice steady and neutral. There was a brief pause on her end, almost imperceptible, before she agreed and ended the call. I placed the phone down and returned to the logs again, not searching for a single answer anymore, but mapping a pattern that was becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss. Whatever had been arranged inside the structure of my life was not accidental, and I was beginning to understand that the real shift had not happened when Jason arrived, but much earlier, in decisions made quietly, without my awareness, long before I ever asked the right question. By the time the afternoon settled over Austin, I had already stopped looking at the villa as a home and started looking at it as a system that could be understood. I sat alone in the study with the security logs still open, going through them again with slower attention, not because I expected to find something new, but because I needed to be certain I was not misreading what was already there. Every entry tied back to a chain of decisions that no longer felt random. The guest access modifications, the external login from Olivia's device, the temporary authorization granted to Jason Miller, all of it formed a sequence that pointed in one direction. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes for a moment, not out of exhaustion, but to organize the timeline in my head. When I opened them again, I began writing everything down in order, separating what I had personally observed from what the system confirmed. That process made it clearer than anything else had. Olivia had not simply introduced someone into our space. She had structured the environment to allow it without interruption. I did not allow emotion to interfere with that conclusion. Instead, I focused on the details that could be verified. I checked the villa's secondary logs, including maintenance records and system updates, and noticed something I had missed before. 2 weeks prior, there had been a scheduled software update initiated through a remote administrative session. The update itself was routine, but the permissions attached to it were not. It had expanded external guest recognition without requiring my direct approval. That change aligned perfectly with the timing of Jason Miller's first recorded access. I stood up and walked through the house slowly, not to confront anything, but to observe how the space now felt under different understanding. The hallway, the kitchen, the entryway, all of it remained physically unchanged, yet every part now carried the weight of context I had not been aware of before. When Olivia returned that evening, she acted as if everything was normal. She asked about my day, mentioned a possible dinner reservation, and moved through the kitchen with the same calm rhythm she always had. I responded in kind, keeping my tone steady, not revealing what I had discovered. There was no point in forcing a confrontation without full clarity. Jason Miller was not present that night, and his absence made the house feel even more structured in its silence, as if his role was defined by timing rather than presence. After Olivia went upstairs, I returned once more to the system, this time focusing on something more specific. I isolated every administrative change made in the last 30 days and compared them against Olivia's known movements. The alignment was too consistent to ignore. Every modification occurred during windows where she had independent access and no recorded communication with me. I exported the full dataset again and stored it in multiple secure locations. As I completed the final backup, I realized that I was no longer trying to prove anything to myself. The evidence had already formed its own conclusion. What remained was understanding the intent behind it. I closed the system and sat in silence for a long time, not because I was uncertain, but because I was beginning to understand that the truth was not a single event. It was a sequence of choices that had been unfolding without my participation, and I was only now seeing the shape of it clearly enough to recognize that it had been in motion far longer than I had realized. I did not confront anything immediately, because by that point confrontation no longer felt like the right tool for understanding what was unfolding. Instead, I shifted my attention outward, focusing on what I could verify beyond the villa systems themselves. I reviewed external service records tied to the property, including vendor logs, maintenance schedules, and guest coordination notes that were typically handled automatically in the background. That is when I noticed a pattern I had not paid attention to before. Several entries referenced scheduled property familiarity visits, a term I had never seen used in our household context. These visits were listed as routine, yet they aligned almost perfectly with the dates Jason Miller had been present. I cross-checked the service provider responsible for managing those entries and found a communication channel linked directly to Olivia's registered contact information. I did not draw conclusions yet, but I could no longer ignore the direction the information was pointing. Later that evening, I sat in the study again and monitored the villa's live access feed in real time. The system was quiet at first, showing only standard background activity, until a new entry appeared. Jason Miller's identifier was triggered at the main gate authorization point. There was no manual override request this time, no visible input from Olivia's device, just a clean authorization that matched previously stored permissions. I watched the timestamp closely, noting that it occurred while Olivia was still out, her location marked at a dinner meeting 20 miles away in downtown Austin. I did not move immediately. I simply observed as the system confirmed entry, and the gate unlocked without resistance. Minutes later, I saw the arrival notification. Jason Miller had entered the property again. I remained inside the study for several seconds, letting the information settle before I stood and moved quietly toward the hallway. There was no urgency in my steps, only calculation. As I approached the front of the villa, I could hear faint movement near the entrance, followed by the sound of the exterior door closing. When I reached the corner leading to the living room, I paused and observed without being seen. Jason stood near the entryway, looking around with the same familiarity I had noticed before, while Olivia was not present. This was the first time the pattern existed without her direct involvement in the moment itself. I stayed back, not revealing my presence, and focused on what this visit represented within the larger sequence I had been documenting. Jason was not acting as a guest in the traditional sense. He moved with the confidence of someone following a known routine, not exploring but continuing something already established. I returned to the study without making contact, and began updating my records with the new information. The structure of events was becoming clearer, not through a single revelation, but through repetition and timing that no longer felt coincidental. Each appearance, each access event, each modification to the system formed a consistent rhythm that pointed toward a prearranged understanding between actions I had not been included in. When Olivia returned later that night, I did not mention what had happened. Instead, I observed her behavior closely, noting how calm she remained, how unchanged her routine appeared despite the presence that had just occurred inside our home. I realized then that the most important detail was not what was happening in front of me, but how long it had been happening without interruption. And as I sat alone after she went upstairs, I understood that whatever truth I was approaching was not hidden in a single moment, but in the continuity of decisions that had been quietly shaping my reality long before I ever thought to question them. I remained in the study long after the house had gone quiet again, not because I was waiting for something to happen, but because I was trying to understand when exactly things had already changed without me noticing. The villa systems continued to run their background checks, status updates, and silent security confirmations, but I was no longer looking at them as neutral infrastructure. I was reading them as records of decisions, each one layered over the last. I reopened the full administrative history one more time and filtered it by identity permissions. That is when I saw a classification I had overlooked before. Jason Miller was not only listed under temporary guest access. He was also linked to a secondary profile designation labeled as trusted contact under household management. That designation carried broader permissions than standard entry access, including extended stay authorization and system familiarity approval. I stared at the screen, letting that detail settle in before I moved further into the logs. The trusted contact status had been assigned through an internal approval sequence tied to Olivia Carter's primary account, confirmed through a multi-step verification that bypassed my direct notification settings. I did not react immediately. Instead, I traced the timeline backward, checking when that designation had first appeared. It had been created nearly 3 weeks before Jason's first visit, during a window when Olivia had been away on what she described as a short work-related trip. The system recorded it as a standard update, but the implications were no longer standard in my mind. I stood up and walked through the house again, this time noticing not just the space, but how access itself had been quietly redistributed. Doors that once required shared confirmation now recognized individual profiles independently. Entry logs no longer reflected equal control, but segmented authority. I returned to the study and sat down slowly, letting the pattern form fully without interruption. What I had initially thought of as isolated incidents now appeared as part of a structured reconfiguration of trust within the system of the home itself. Later that night, I accessed the communication archive tied to the property management interface and found a series of brief messages exchanged between Olivia's account and the system administrator channel. The content was minimal, mostly confirmation prompts and adjustment approvals, but the consistency of timing aligned with every major access change I had identified. There was no direct mention of intent, no explicit statement that could be interpreted without context, yet the outcome of each interaction remained the same. Permissions were expanded, access was refined, and Jason Miller's presence became increasingly integrated into the villa's recognition system. I closed the archive and leaned back, realizing that what I had been trying to identify as a single truth was actually distributed across many small decisions that had never been presented to me as connected. When Olivia returned home later that night, I did not ask her any questions. I observed her as she moved through the space, as if nothing had shifted, as if the structure of our shared environment remained unchanged. Jason was not present this time, but his absence felt intentional rather than neutral. I understood then that the situation was no longer defined by his visits alone, but by the framework that made those visits possible without my awareness. As I sat alone after she went upstairs, I realized that I was no longer looking for proof of what had happened. I was looking at the shape of a system that had already been built, one that I had lived inside without fully seeing how its rules had been rewritten around me. I did not move from the study even when the night grew deeper, because at that point movement no longer felt necessary to gather information. I already had enough pieces to understand that what I was seeing was not a single incident but a structured pattern that had been unfolding over time. The villa was quiet, but it was no longer the kind of quiet I used to associate with comfort. It now felt like a space holding too many invisible decisions. I reopened the full access timeline again, focusing on the sequence of events rather than individual entries. What stood out was not just who had been granted access, but the rhythm of how those permissions had been adjusted. Each change followed a consistent cycle, always initiated during periods when Olivia had independent control of the system. I cross-referenced those moments with external calendar logs tied to her account, and the overlap was exact. There were no contradictions in timing, only gaps in communication that had never been explained. I leaned forward and studied the earliest point of modification, the moment when Jason Miller first transitioned from unknown guest to recognized trusted contact. That single designation had effectively restructured how the villa responded to his presence, removing friction from entry points and reducing verification layers. I sat back and let that realization settle without interruption. It was not the presence of Jason that defined the situation anymore, but the infrastructure that allowed his presence to become normal. I stood up and walked slowly through the house again, this time paying attention to how the environment responded to movement. Doors, lighting systems, and access panels all reflected a network of permissions that no longer felt uniform. There was a segmentation I had not noticed before, as if the house itself had learned to differentiate between levels of familiarity. I stopped near the main corridor and observed how the system reacted to my presence compared to earlier interactions I had reviewed in the logs. The difference was subtle but consistent enough to register as intentional design rather than coincidence. Later, I returned to the study and compiled everything into a single timeline document, aligning system changes, access events, and external confirmations into one continuous sequence. What emerged was a clear progression, not of isolated actions, but of coordinated adjustments over time. Each step reinforced the next, building a structure that had been established gradually rather than abruptly. When Olivia came home that night, I did not ask her about anything I had found. I observed her behavior as she moved through the space, noting how unaffected she appeared by the underlying structure I had now identified. Jason was not present, but his absence did not reduce the weight of what I understood. If anything, it emphasized how normalized his role had become within the system that governed the villa. I realized then that the most important shift was not in who had entered the house, but in how access, trust, and presence had been redefined without my direct involvement. And as I remained alone after she went upstairs, I understood that I was no longer trying to uncover isolated truths, but rather mapping a complete system that had already been operating long before I became aware of its full design. I stayed in the study longer than I intended, not because I was waiting for anything new to appear, but because I had reached a point where waiting felt like the only rational response to a system that was revealing itself in layers rather than moments. The villa was quiet again, but my attention was no longer on the present state of the house. It was on the structure beneath it, the architecture of decisions that had been quietly assembled over time. I reopened the compiled timeline document and reviewed it from the beginning, not focusing on individual entries anymore, but on the progression as a whole. What I saw was no longer fragmented. It was sequential, deliberate in its consistency. Each modification to access, each authorization change, each system update tied back to a narrow set of control points that always traced through Olivia's account. I did not need to speculate any more about intent. I only needed to understand scope. The scope was broader than I had initially assumed, extending beyond Jason Miller and into the way the villa itself had been redefined in terms of who could enter, when, and under what conditions. I closed the document and stood up, moving slowly through the house again, but this time I was not observing it as a space. I was observing it as a record. Every point of entry, every corridor, every automated system response now carried context I had not been aware of before. I paused near the main entrance and watched the gate interface from inside, noticing how it now responded differently depending on stored profiles rather than direct confirmation. That distinction mattered more than anything else I had uncovered so far. Later that evening, Olivia returned home earlier than usual. She moved through the kitchen with the same calm rhythm, placing her keys down, asking simple questions, maintaining the structure of normal conversation. I responded in the same measured way, careful not to disrupt the surface of the moment. Jason was not with her, and she did not mention him. That absence, however, no longer carried neutrality. It carried structure. I observed how she avoided lingering in any one place, how her attention remained distributed across routine actions rather than specific focus points. When she eventually asked if everything was fine, I paused before answering, choosing words that maintained continuity rather than confrontation. I said everything was fine because I needed more time to understand what fine actually meant in a system that had already been quietly adjusted without my participation. After she went upstairs, I returned to the study and opened one final section of the system logs, the administrative override history. That is where I found the final layer I had not yet connected. A master configuration change had been executed during one of her reported absences, not tied to any guest entry, but to a structural update in household hierarchy permissions. The effect of that change was not limited to access. It redefined authorization priority within the entire system. I stared at the entry without moving, not because I was surprised, but because I finally understood that I had not been watching isolated events. I had been watching the gradual rewriting of control itself. And in that moment, the question was no longer about who had entered the villa, or how often, or why. The question had shifted entirely to how long the structure of my own life had been operating under rules I had never been fully aware were changed. I did not sleep that night. Not because of emotion, but because I had reached a point where every detail I had collected demanded structure, not rest. The villa was quiet around me, but the silence no longer felt passive. It felt like a system waiting for input. I sat in the study with every file I had exported open across multiple screens, aligning timestamps, access logs, and administrative overrides into a single continuous map. What had started as scattered anomalies was now forming a complete operational pattern. The most important discovery was no longer the presence of Jason Miller, or even the frequency of his access. It was the fact that the hierarchy of control inside the villa had been redefined at a level that placed my account beneath another internal authority layer I had never approved. That realization changed my approach entirely. I stopped treating the situation as something to observe and started treating it as something to test. I began by isolating a single system function, the main gate authorization protocol. I reset my focus on it, not to challenge it directly, but to see how it would respond under controlled conditions. I initiated a standard diagnostic request through my account, something routine enough that it should pass without interference. The system responded, but not in the way it used to. There was a delay, subtle but measurable, followed by a secondary verification layer that had not been present before. That layer did not request my confirmation. It referenced another authority profile before allowing the request to proceed. I leaned forward and documented the response without interruption. The structure was now undeniable. My access was no longer primary in certain functions. It was conditional. I closed the diagnostic window and shifted focus to external confirmation. I reviewed the villa's scheduled activity logs for the next day and noticed a planned guest entry window that had already been pre-approved. Jason Miller was listed again, this time with extended duration access and unrestricted zone permissions across the property. The authorization timestamp had been finalized 2 days earlier, during another period where Olivia's account showed independent system interaction. I did not react outwardly. Instead, I began mapping the sequence in reverse, tracing every structural change back to its origin point. What emerged was not a single decision, but a continuous pattern of reclassification, each step reinforcing the next until the system itself no longer reflected equal ownership. I stood up and walked through the house again, this time focusing on physical spaces that corresponded to digital permissions. The front gate, the entry corridor, the internal access points, all of them now represented different levels of control that had been reassigned without direct discussion. When Olivia came downstairs briefly later that night, I observed her more carefully than before. She moved through the kitchen with the same composed rhythm, but I now understood that her sense of normality was built on a structure I had only recently begun to see. She asked if I was still working, and I said I was finishing something important. The answer was technically true, but incomplete. After she returned upstairs, I made a final decision for the night. I disabled all passive notifications tied to the Villa system on my personal device and switched to manual monitoring only. If the structure had been adjusted without my awareness, then the only way forward was to observe it in real time without interference. As I sat back in the dim light of the study, I understood that the situation was no longer about uncovering what had already happened. It was about watching what would happen next under a system that had quietly stopped treating me as its central point of reference. I started the next morning with a level of focus that had nothing to do with emotion and everything to do with verification. The villa was quiet again, but I no longer experienced that quiet as comfort. It felt procedural, like a space waiting to execute whatever rules had already been written into it. I sat in the study and reopened the full system architecture overview, not the logs this time, but the configuration hierarchy itself. I needed to understand not just what had changed, but what layer of control allowed those changes to persist without triggering alerts. As I moved through the structure, I found it. A delegated administrative tier labeled Household Continuity Protocol. It was not a feature I had ever enabled, nor had I ever received a request to activate it. Yet it sat above my standard permissions in specific categories, particularly access management and guest authentication. I traced its activation history and found the origin point again tied to Olivia's account, executed during a system optimization update that had appeared routine at the time. I leaned back and let that information settle without interruption. The implications were no longer abstract. They were operational. This protocol effectively allowed secondary authorization pathways to override primary account awareness under defined conditions. I stood up and walked through the villa again, not to observe the space itself, but to test how that structure behaved in real time. I initiated a standard request through the home interface, something as simple as adjusting climate control settings in the living room. The system responded instantly, but the response route was not direct. It passed through a validation layer that referenced the same continuity protocol before confirming execution. I repeated the test with a different function, lighting control in the entry corridor, and received the same pattern. There was a consistent rerouting of authority that I had never been made aware of. Later that day, I reviewed external access synchronization records again, focusing on the intersection between physical entry and digital authorization. Jason Miller's profile remained active, but what changed was not his presence. It was the persistence of his classification. He was no longer being treated as a temporary guest within the system architecture. He had been embedded into a sustained recognition category that allowed repeated access without revalidation. I documented everything into a single consolidated report, not because I intended to present it yet, but because clarity required structure. As evening approached, Olivia returned home and the pattern repeated itself in a way that now felt predictable rather than uncertain. She moved through the house with calm precision, unaware or unaffected by the internal structure I had uncovered. Jason did not appear that night, but his absence did not alter the underlying system state I had already confirmed. When she asked about my day, I responded normally, maintaining the surface continuity of conversation while monitoring every subtle behavioral cue. There was no visible disruption in her routine, no indication that anything had shifted in her awareness of the environment we shared. After she went upstairs, I remained in the study and performed one final diagnostic comparison between current system permissions and the original installation baseline. The divergence was now complete and irreversible in practical terms. What had once been a shared control environment had gradually transformed into a layered authority structure with distributed decision pathways. I closed the system interface and sat in silence, not because I was uncertain, but because I understood fully that I was no longer dealing with isolated permissions or individual actions. I was observing a redefined system of control that had been established incrementally over time, and every new piece of evidence confirmed the same conclusion. The only thing left was to determine how far that structure extended beyond what I had already seen. I did not move for a long time after completing the final system comparison, because there was nothing left in the data that felt uncertain. The villa, the permissions, the access hierarchy, and the repeated authorization patterns had all converged into a single conclusion that no longer required additional verification. What remained was not confusion, but clarity about structure. I sat in the study with the screens dimmed, letting the silence of the house settle around me in a way that felt different from before. It was no longer the silence of a home. It was the silence of a system that had reached a stable configuration without my central involvement. I reviewed the final compiled report one last time, not to search for new details, but to confirm that nothing contradicted what I already understood. Every layer of access, every modification, every external interaction tied back to a controlled sequence of adjustments that had been implemented gradually over time. There was no single breaking point, no moment where everything changed at once. Instead, it had been a continuous process of redefinition, each step small enough to appear harmless in isolation, but collectively significant enough to reshape the entire environment. I closed the report and powered down the system interface, not out of frustration, but because further analysis was no longer necessary. I stood up and walked through the villa slowly, not as someone searching for answers, but as someone confirming that the answers were already reflected in the structure itself. The doors, the corridors, the entry points, and the control panels all existed exactly as they had before, but their meaning had changed entirely. They were no longer neutral elements of a shared space. They were components of a hierarchy I had only recently become fully aware of. When Olivia returned that evening, there was nothing in her behavior that suggested disruption. She moved through the house with the same familiarity as always, speaking in the same calm tone, maintaining the rhythm of daily life as if nothing had shifted beneath it. Jason Miller was not present, and there were no new access events recorded in the system logs, yet his absence did not restore simplicity. It only reinforced the structure that had already been established in my understanding. I responded to Olivia normally, matching her tone, keeping the surface of the interaction intact, while observing everything from a different internal perspective. I no longer needed to search for inconsistencies, because I had already mapped them. After she went upstairs, I remained alone in the study for the final time that night, reviewing the entire sequence from the beginning in my mind rather than on the screen. What had started as a single question about access had expanded into a complete reconstruction of how control within the villa had been distributed, reassigned, and maintained without my direct awareness. I understood then that the system I had been analyzing was not simply technical. It was structural in a broader sense, reflecting decisions made over time that had gradually shifted the balance of authority in ways that could not be reversed by a single action. I did not feel anger. I did not feel urgency. What I felt was recognition. And in that recognition, I understood that the final truth was not about who had entered the villa or how often they had done so. It was about how long I had been living inside a framework that had already been rewritten before I ever thought to question it, and how that realization now changed the way everything that followed would inevitably unfold.